All right, I'll go ahead and get started so we can get to our webinar today. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you might be. Welcome to this webinar. On behalf of APA Division 47, the Society for Sport, Exercise, and Performance Psychology, and the Division 47 Diversity Collective, we're so glad that you're joining us today. My name's Olivia. I'm one of the Division 47 Diversity Collective members, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're here, introduce Dr. Krane, go through a little bit of the logistics, and then we'll get rolling right into the lecture. So first, the Diversity Collective was established to create opportunities for members to actively contribute to the division's equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. Members of the collective share leadership responsibilities and curate events, panels, resources, and initiatives that foster culturally humble practices and meet the evolving needs of our members and our field. Today's webinar reflects that commitment. This session is a continuation of the 2025 Stephen R. Heyman Memorial Keynote Lecture presented at the APA convention. We are honored to welcome Dr. Vikki Krane, who will present Protecting Women's Sport, Red Herrings, Dog Whistles, and Incendiary Politics. In this talk, Dr. Krane examines how, despite the appearance of support, a veiled attack on women's sport is being advanced through a movement claiming to protect girls and women athletes. Advocates of this movement argue that transgender girls and women threaten fair play and safety, despite limited substantive evidence supporting those claims. Rather than safeguarding women's sport, policies that exclude trans athletes have intensified scrutiny and bodily surveillance of all athletes, particularly those perceived as too queer, too immigrant, or too Black. This conversation invites us to think critically about who is being protected, who is being targeted, and how sports psychology professionals can respond ethically and responsibly in this socio-political moment. Dr. Krane has authored and edited numerous influential publications addressing feminist sports psychology, LGBTQ+ inclusion, and how the sociocultural dynamics of sport participation. Their scholarship has significantly shaped how the field understands identity, power, and equity in athletic contexts. We are grateful for their continued leadership in this important work. Before we begin, we want to establish shared expectations for today's space. This topic touches identity, policy, ethics, and lived experience. It may challenge assumptions or evoke strong reactions. We welcome thoughtful engagement, and we ask that it be grounded in respect. As participants, we commit to listen with curiosity rather than defensiveness, to speak from our own experience, to avoid personal attacks or inflammatory language, to engage ideas critically without targeting individuals or communities, to hold space for complexity, and to encourage cultural humility and openness throughout today's discussion. Our goal is not uniform agreement. Our goal is deeper understanding and professional responsibility. Before we begin, just a few logistical notes. We expect this session to last approximately 75 minutes total, including the 15-minute Q&A. All participants should see the Q&A box and pose questions for our speaker. Please click Q&A at the bottom of your screen to access it. I will pose questions to Dr. Krane based on those submitted in the Q&A. And please type your questions as you think of them during the session rather than waiting until the end. Later this afternoon, you'll receive an evaluation via email. Please complete the evaluation in order to receive your certificate. The Continuing Education Committee has approved this webinar for 1 hour of continuing education. To receive your certificate, you must complete the online evaluation. And please also note that today's session is being recorded and will be available in the archive on the Division 47's YouTube channel. If you have any questions on logistics, please put those in the Q&A as well. At this time, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Dr. Vikki Krane. Dr. Krane, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Olivia. That was great. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I first want to thank the leadership group from Division 47 for the invitation, for both to do the Heyman lecture and to be here today. Particularly Chelsea Battle, Bree Jones-Kaplan did a lot of work to make all of this happen. I appreciate all of your efforts. I couldn't help but notice a whole lot of familiar faces, I guess I should say names, scrolling by on my screen. So it's great to see people I know from all walks of my life, it seems, as well as everybody else. And I appreciate you all being here. And I wondered, given all the electricity outages, et cetera, if we'd have a good audience. And this is great. So I appreciate you all taking time out of your day to be here with me. One thing I'm just going to mention that there's a slight chance that should my male person walk by, there will be a loud barking behind me. So if that happens, I will quickly mute. So if there's suddenly the sound goes off for a moment, bear with me. I will come right back. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, here we go. So obviously you heard my title, Protecting Women's Sports, Red Herrings, Dog Whistles, and Incendiary Politics. We often hear that we are in a moment. This is an amazing time for women's sports. A lot of really amazing things are happening right now. We're seeing increases in fandom, increases in salaries, attendance, new leagues are coming out. Women's sports seems to just be gaining huge amounts of attention, positive attention. Great things are happening. We also have this parallel going on where there's this large push among some people to protect girls and women's sports, to save women's sports. All this note about what we need to do to keep women's sport safe. The reality is this is not about keeping all of women's sports safe, is truly focused on keeping transgender women out of women's sport. We've got these two things going on at the same time. I think they're interrelated. What I want to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about what are the cultural messages about transgender athletes that lead to certain opinions and expectations, and what do we know from the research, from the science, and kind of juxtapose those throughout. And then I'm going to, towards the end, circle back to why I think this is going on in this particular moment of sport. Generally speaking, we see three primary issues that come into play when people talk about the need to ban trans athletes, particularly from women's sports. And I'm going to be focused on women's sport, obviously, through this. One, there's this assumption that trans athletes, if allowed, are going to take over and take opportunities away from others. There's concerns that locker rooms will be unsafe if we allow transgender athletes to be in them. And then there's these concerns that really are wrapped around beliefs about testosterone, in which it's unfair. Trans athletes have some sort of special advantages, which are going to lead to safety and injury concerns. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each one of these. Concerning the takeover, the supposed takeover. What we know and the best stats that we see, approximately 1% of the US population is transgender. Mullen and her colleagues were able to estimate that approximately 1.6% of NCAA athletes identify as trans and non-binary. Obviously, these statistics were taken before the NCAA banned trans athletes, because at the moment, none are allowed to participate. But we're talking about a very small percentage of athletes. Presumably, they're going to take over and take opportunities away from others. I think we need to look at this historically to kind of get a sense of where we're at. In 2004, the International Olympic Committee adopted the Stockholm Consensus. In brief, this was the policy that provided guidelines for transgender inclusion in Olympic and international sport. They've tweaked the policy a bit over the years prior to the bans. They tweaked the policy, but since 2004, up until very recently, transgender athletes were allowed to compete in international and elite level sport. The NCAA in 2011 adopted policy that also provided guidelines for the inclusion of transgender athletes. Now think about this. How many transgender athletes can you name who have been participating anytime in the last roughly 25 years? The reality is, in 2011, Outsports identified 45 out trans athletes from from today back to 2011. There were 45 out trans athletes in college sport. In 2024, the year prior to the NCAA ban on trans athletes, there were less than 10 out of 510,000. So we're not seeing huge numbers of trans athletes taking over any sports. We occasionally hear about them here and there, only when they win, and I will come back to that point. So the numbers of trans athletes aren't going to allow us to say they're going to take over. I do want to say, if we look at that 1.6% and we think about 510,000 athletes, that means there were roughly 8,000 athletes who identify as trans and non-binary. While it's a small number, I still want to emphasize we're still very concerned for those athletes, and we want to do everything we can, ideally, to ensure that those athletes are safe and included and having good experiences, which obviously is a challenge in today's world, but bear with me. The second major concern is locker rooms, that if we allow transgender athletes, according to some sources, that will make girls' and women's locker rooms unsafe. In fact, Champion Women, one of the organizations that has a very strong stance in this protect women's sport mode. Champion Women put out a white paper in 2023 in which they said that transgender athletes want to be in locker rooms because they are motivated, and this is a direct quote, motivated by a desire to commit sexual offenses, flashing, voyeurism, assault, and rape. And this will be traumatic for cisgender women. Well, first, this suggests that all trans people, trans females, are sexual predators, which we know is far, far from the truth. We also know when we look at the statistics, primarily of the people who are sexual predators, it is primarily heterosexual cisgender males, but yet they're targeting the transgender athletes with these assumptions. But also, let's look at what the research says about transgender athletes' experiences in locker rooms. We see that consistently across studies. When transgender athletes are interviewed about their experiences, they describe being in the locker room as perceived as unsafe. There they encounter surveillance, scrutiny, harassment, and violence, and athletes and exercisers who are transgender report doing what they can to avoid locker rooms. Locker rooms are perceived to be unsafe for transgender athletes. When we think about this, research with high school age athletes, high school and middle school athletes in particular, we see that 70% of transgender athletes transgender students avoid locker rooms altogether if they can. 45% of non-binary, 43% of LGBTQ plus students. We also see that roughly half of transgender and gender expansive youth and about 40% of LGBTQ plus youth talk about feeling unsafe in locker rooms. In fact, across several studies, locker rooms for high school and middle school age student athletes are perceived as the least safe places on their school campuses. So when we talk about locker room safety, it's not typically the cisgender athletes that need protecting. The fair play argument, boy, we could talk about this for my whole time. So bear with me as I kind of lay out what I think are some of the main concerns that are voiced. There's concerns that if we allowed transgender athletes, and generally they are focused on, as it's described, athletes who have gone through male puberty, as being unsafe or being unfair in the locker rooms. So let's talk about what makes an advantage. What is it that gives people an advantage in sport? Honestly, the reality is successful athletes are not normal. They have exceptional qualities. They're exceptionally big, broad, tall, and sometimes small. We don't think of these as unfair advantages, just variations in human beings. But yet, when an individual is labeled as trans, suddenly their height is an unfair advantage, or other physical attributes become an unfair advantage. These are all Olympic athletes. They come in all shapes and sizes. There is not a body that is built to excel in sport. They compete across different sports. So when we think of bodies, trans and cis, but cisgender bodies vary as much within a sex as they do across sexes. So when we talk about being assigned male at birth gives one an automatic benefit to athletic performance, that's not necessarily true, and certainly not for all people. Much of the conversation around this unfair advantage is wrapped up around this belief about testosterone. Athletic gold. Individuals who have more testosterone in their bodies are perceived to have performance advantages in sport. And we see this played out with intersex athletes at the Olympic level, as well as aimed at trans female athletes. The cultural narrative, if we think about everything you've ever learned about testosterone, all just the everyday common conversation, oh, boys will be boys, boys are rough and tumble. And they're often talking about little boys before they've gone through puberty. That there's this assumption that boys are different from girls because of the testosterone that is supposedly in their bodies. Testosterone is what gives boys their bigger size, power, strength. Testosterone makes one more competitive, more aggressive, more athletic. These cultural narratives, it's hard to really understand what's in the research because there's not a consistent consensus in the research as to the impact of testosterone. We know there are certain things. The average male is bigger, taller than the average female. Most of this research is done with non-athletes. We can also think about whether or not how that impacts athletic performance. And there we also see some questioning. Back to that in a second. When we talk about the cultural narratives, we are so used to the assumption that boys will be boys because testosterone makes them that way, that we often don't stop to interpret data and interpret other things in ways that maybe counter this. Because obviously we see female athletes who are big and powerful and strong and competitive and aggressive and highly athletic who don't have the same levels of testosterone, very likely, than some of the male athletes that they might be compared to. We talk about this unfair advantage, that an athlete who has gone through male puberty brings these unfair advantages. Well, let's look at these two athletes. You may know Leah Thomas is the University of Pennsylvania swimmer, transgender athlete, has a lot of controversy around her performances. Katie Ledecky, world-class Olympic swimmer, in the news a lot today. Thomas has won NCAA championship to their name and a couple of Ivy League swimming records. Ledecky has over 30 world records to her name. Who has the unfair advantage? Is there an unfair advantage? They're roughly the same size. Had no one known that Thomas was transgender, it would have just been, oh, typical Ivy League swimmer. And truly, no offense to my Ivy League colleagues out there, but in all honesty, who ever paid attention to Ivy League women's swimming until people found out there was a transgender athlete there? Had Thomas not been known to be transgender, there would be no concern. Just another good, but not exceptional athlete. Katie Ledecky is lauded for all of her successes. There's a couple of sources, and these are two of them, in which they've done a thorough review of the literature about testosterone and athletic performance. And the E-Alliance from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, they concluded that there is no substantial evidence that elite trans athletes have a biological advantage. Jordan Young and Carcazes wrote the book Testosterone: An Unauthorized Biography. One of their conclusions is there is no consistent relationship between testosterone and performance in female athletes. Yet we base a lot of our assumptions about trans inclusion and intersex inclusion, but for this talk, trans inclusion in sport, on this assumption that that testosterone gives people some sort of exceptional advantage. The research doesn't bear this out at this point. This you all probably know a little bit about. When people go on hormone therapy, trans females decrease testosterone, increase estrogen. After a year or two, we see a decrease in muscle mass, decrease in bone content, decrease in bone density, and a redistribution of body fat to be more consistent with female bodies. Trans male athletes, we see a decrease in estrogen, increase in testosterone, they increase their muscle mass, and their body fat is redistributed more consistent with a cisgender male athlete. Importantly, there's been several recent studies and recent reviews that have looked at measures of physical fitness. And what do we see when we compare transgender people who have transitioned with hormone therapy and compare their performances to cisgender women? And generally speaking, across studies, we see that on measures of physical fitness, trans women, their scores, their abilities are more consistent with cisgender women than cisgender men. Now, the reality of much of this research is it's not with elite athletes. Because as I pointed out earlier, there are not a lot of trans elite athletes to do research with. These are studies with people who are exercisers, sometimes military personnel. They might be athletes, but just not necessarily at the elite level. A lot of the research is really equivocal because of that, because we're looking at different populations. We're looking at different types of exercise, fitness, sporting abilities. The research is a little scattered, but one of the consistent conclusions is that when people go on hormone therapy, they're much more consistent with their cisgender peers than they are, in this case with the women, with the cisgender men in their performances. Something we often don't talk about are the puberty blockers. When we talk about young people who are transgender, if this is fitting for their circumstances, they can go on a puberty blocker that literally pauses puberty. This occurs when someone identifies as transgender at a very young age, when their family, their medical team, that probably includes a pediatrician, an endocrinologist, a psychologist, who often should be an expert in gender, but there is a team of professionals and family that make these decisions. When someone pauses their puberty, it stops the development of secondary sex characteristics. This is mostly reversible. When we literally, when they go on puberty blockers, things are paused. They have an opportunity to kind of grow up, decide what's in their best interest as they get older. This often happens when kids, they could be as young as 12 years old when they start puberty and are able to go on puberty blockers. One thing it does is it also slows the growth spurt, and chances are they're going to be shorter than their peers. So when we think about young trans student athletes and what advantages they have not gone through puberty. They do not have the hormonal changes that their peers have, and they're probably shorter. So in reality, they might be at a disadvantage on the athletic field compared to their cisgender peers. What we do know, however, the research is very consistent in this. When young transgender people go on puberty blockers, it greatly improves their mental well-being. I mean, imagine a young trans male who has lived as a boy, gone to school as a boy, been on the boys' teams, hits puberty and suddenly starts developing breasts. Imagine how traumatic that can be. Puberty blockers assures that that won't happen. Pauses puberty until the child or their family, their medical community decide what is the best steps. And there's also what are called the standards of medical care. And this puts a certain, generally speaking, transgender people will not go on cross-gender hormone therapy until they're at least 16 years old. And that is put forward by the medical community. So when we're talking about children younger than that, this pauses puberty, gives them an opportunity to decide if they want to do further changes to their body, but allows them time and mental well-being. Yet we're still seeing all these trans athlete bans. So bear with me. Look at this list. This is a very short list. Obviously, this list is constantly growing. But look at the last two. Pool Federation, Chess Federation. This is more than about concerns about physical advantages. There is no physical advantage in chess. Probably not in playing pool either. There are other reasons, I would suggest, that we are seeing these bans. But before that, let's talk a little bit about the impact of the bans, and then I'm going to circle back to why I think this is going on. Current research, recent research is showing us that the commentary around the politics of banning transgender athletes has had a grave effect on transgender people. 85% of transgender youth report that the anti-trans politics increase their anger, feelings of hopelessness, feeling unsafe, and suicide ideations. Farr et al. Specifically concluded that familiarity with the laws that ban transgender athletes is associated with suicidality. There are very real impacts of the current climate and the vitriol being sent at, particularly in this case, transgender female athletes. Notice again that these statistics were before the outright bans, before most organizations put on, or the national executive order that banned all athletes from all trans athletes from school athletics. What often isn't talked about also is the impact of these bans on all athletes. All athletes in women's sport, girls in women's sport, are impacted by the commentary and the behaviors that come about because of these bans. One, there is an increase in gender surveillance and an increase in body surveillance. We are already seeing examples where young girls are being called out because they look too boyish, they're too good, they're too muscular. Where elite athletes are perceived, you're too strong, you're too good. This harkens back to the days when female athletes were convinced that they shouldn't be too masculine because they'd be labeled as lesbian. Now it's about gender identity. If you don't have the right body, if you're not looking appropriately female, acting appropriately female, then you're going to be called out. This is going to impact all female athletes and put a cap on performance. You can't be too muscular. You can't be too good, or somebody might call you out, or you might be pulled out and asked to go under scrutiny. All of this reinforces traditional gender stereotypes. It also teaches kids, athletes, to discriminate against people they don't think looks appropriate. We're also seeing laws, there are bills that are out there that are being debated, in which Washington State, one part of one of their bills about banning transgender athletes, also included surveilling the bodies of all female athletes, which includes a visual examination to ensure that that person is truly female. As children, as parents and coaches of 10, 12-year-olds, we don't want doctors scrutinizing people's genitals to determine if they belong in sport. So what? Why is this going on? Here's where I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about why I think we're in this moment having these concerns and why the politics are such against trans athletes, combined with a current moment in women's sport where we're seeing all these other seemingly positive things happening. So bear with me for a moment as I lay some foundation here. First, we know that when girls participate in sport, compared to their non-athletic peers, they have better school performance, greater social mobility, and ultimately higher earnings throughout their life. Pretty powerful. Women college athletes learn leadership capabilities. And this is what Cheryl et al. Called a vibrant pipeline of leadership that takes people from sport into their professional careers. Girls learn amazing lessons. Young women learn amazing lessons through sport that carry them into their professional careers and give them ways of being leaders and being highly successful later in life. We see this in these statistics. 94% of women senior business executives participated in sport. 80% of Forbes Fortune 500 female executives participated in sport. Sport is a powerful learning opportunity, a powerful experience that takes people into the professional lives and helps them be highly successful. There are some people who find this threatening. When women's sport gains increased parity with men's sport, it signals social change. It signals that women are becoming equals, that women are gaining corporate power, wielding political clout, and upending long-standing masculine structures. This is what the current vitriol thrown at trans athletes is trying to address. If we pit female athletes who are already marginalized in sport against another group of female athletes, and we have them policing each other, now we're putting a limit on what they can do. Now we're reducing opportunities for some people. This is all much more than sport. This is one cog in a much larger political movement. It's about policing women, all women, and maintaining a very specific gender order. It's about bodily and medical autonomy. There are bills now limiting reproductive rights, which influences medical decisions. And we're seeing what trans people, particularly trans children, are allowed to do to their own bodies. It's targeting freedom of expression, how one wants to present themselves. Education and free speech. We are being limited in the classrooms. I'm in a state that starting next year is going to be very specific on what we can and cannot talk about. The types of things that we can address in our classes. Our education, what books our students can read. This is also about racial justice, LGBTQ rights. I should have on here immigrant rights. These are all wrapped up together. All of these things are interacting to put us in this current political moment. Now, circling back to protect women's sport. What would protecting women's sport, what could it look like? Just imagine. What if instead of going after trans athletes, we eradicated sexual predators, fired emotionally abusive coaches? We are seeing far too many girls and women that are impacted abused sexually, emotionally in their sport settings. If we could address these two things, women's and girls' sport would be so much safer for so many people, rather than targeting the small number of trans athletes. We could increase funding, media, and marketing, which you might be thinking to yourself, we're in a moment. These things are all increasing. While we are seeing better stats on all of these things than ever before, we are still far below the levels of what's being given to boys and men's sport. We could provide equal opportunity. Here we are, 50 some years post the passage of Title IX in the US. And yet, over 80% of schools and universities are not fully compliant. Imagine if we had equal opportunity, we wouldn't have to worry about some of these other concerns. And what if we could stop sexualizing, objectifying, and feminizing female athletes? This last one is exactly what bans on trans athletes reinforces us to do. It's going to cause people to ensure that they look feminine enough, sexy enough, pretty enough to not be considered, not to be labeled transgender, not to be called out. There are lots of things we could do that would protect women's sport. Going after the small number of transgender athletes and teaching people to be bigoted against them isn't really all that helpful. Now, I'm consistently asked, how do we support transgender athletes today when they're not in our sport climates? For those of you who are sports psychologists, coaches, they're not there anymore. They've been banned if you work in school sport. Well, here's a handful of things that I think we all still can do. One is be present for them. Show your concern and support. If you know of athletes that can't be in their sport environments, reach out to them. Let them know you're there. Let them know people still care. We can start to question the binary. And I get this is huge. By that, I mean, look at how sport is organized. We consistently, without questioning, boys here, girls there. We might want to start questioning, is that the best way to organize sport? Now, I realize this is a really hard thing to think about when we're talking college and elite sport, but let's talk about high school and younger, youth sport. Is there any reason 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, boys and girls can't be on the same Pee-wee soccer team together? Imagine what the kids might learn from each other. Rather than an us-them mentality about sport, they'll learn from each other. Who the better athletes are, it doesn't matter if you're a boy or girl, trans, non-binary, whatever it might be. So I think it's time to start rethinking how we organize sport. And I get that that's a huge thing, but there are some things we can start doing along the way at this point. We need to continue to fight racism, homonegativism, ableism, etc., because all of these isms overlap. These are intersecting axes of oppression. They all work together to create a particular political climate. Which leads me to the bottom suggestion is we need to get political. Now, I get it. It's sort of like, what can I do to impact what happens in the White House? Probably not a lot, to be perfectly honest, at this very moment, but there's things that you can do. Think local. You can get political in your school system. Participate on the PTA, Parent-Teacher Association. Get involved with the sports in your schools. Be involved in your school boards. There you can talk to people, educate other parents about why should we be concerned about young trans athletes, or how do we show support and provide avenues for inclusion. You can get political at the state level. You can get political nationally by emailing, phone calls, letter writing. There are things that you can do, and get involved in the protests if that's something you want to do. There are things we can do. But think locally, because that's where we're more likely to see the most obvious actual change, where we feel the most control. And then we can go bigger from there. But there are things. I do think it is, while I mentioned that there's a small number of trans athletes, we still need to take care of them. You all are here associated with the APA. We need to be concerned for them. So what's at stake in all this? The reality is, when we talk about unfair advantages, typically people are thinking college and professional elite sport. They're typically thinking the more successful or the more competitive levels of sport, sometimes high school sport as well. Think of it as an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg, the elite athletes at the very tip, as I showed you in the statistics, they're very few. These bans are mostly affecting young children. Think of it. When we look at elementary and middle school age sport, roughly 1% of them make it to college sport. And from there, roughly 5% of them make it to professional or Olympic sport. Of them, maybe 1% are trans, 1 to 2%. At the bottom of that iceberg, you've got the kids. Most of the people being impacted by the bans on transgender athletes are young kids who just want to go play sports they think are fun and be with their friends. We're keeping little children out of sport. Now think about it. This is an already vulnerable population when we think in terms of their mental health. This is not because they're trans, but rather because of the climate around them, the bigotry, the discrimination they face. Young trans people are at greater risk for depression, anxiety, suicidality. If they participate in sport, we think of the benefits. People who participate in sport gain mental health benefits, physical health, emotional health. They gain a sense of belonging and sense of community. All of these things can help them cope with the discrimination that they might be facing in other avenues of their life. The research is fairly consistent and shows that when young trans and other queer athletes are in a hostile environment, when there is one supportive adult, it changes that experience for the better. To me, the answer is simple. Be that person. I don't think it's hyperbole to say you might actually save a life by doing so. Here are some organizations if you want some more information about how to support transgender athletes, how to support some of the legal battles that are going through. These organizations, and they are not all of them by any means, but just some. And I think at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I left a fair amount of time because I really want to hear what you all want to talk about. I covered a lot of ground. So I am happy to answer questions and see what you all have been putting into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krane, for that thoughtful and important presentation. All right, so we're going to transition into our Q&A. And as I keep monitoring the chat, keep throwing questions in. Thank you so much. As a reminder, this is being recorded and will be available after the presentation. I'm curious, especially as you were talking about the research and right now in our society, research is often being scrutinized, the scientific process is being scrutinized. How do you go about sharing research with people who may have, like, take a second guess at it or be a little more resistant to research?
I get asked that a lot, and I don't know if I have a great answer. It's not easy, I'll be honest. I mean, I've taught numerous classes in social justice over the years, and we talk about these kinds of issues. And there's a certain level of person that comes in like set in their opinion, and they really don't want to learn differently. They want to know why they're right, or they're just not open-minded. So I think one of the things is to try to present it in an easily digestible manner. It depends on my audience. I mean, with students, we can talk about, I try to give them readings that kind of present two sides to think about, in which we can have conversations about in classes and try to encourage them to talk. I won't say I'm exceptionally Successful are that at times because it gets frustrating. But I think when you're talking, for example, with parents, I think if we talk in kind of lay language and bring it down to here's what we know about, because there's so many concerns like on puberty blockers that, we're doing gender mutilation on children. It's like, well, no, these are young people. They're, 12, 13-ish, 11, 12, 13 years old, that this is what we know that actually happens, that even if people wanted to supposedly do gender mutilation, the medical community won't do that until they're roughly 18 years old or older, typically. So it's not happening. So trying to maybe, I think one of the things is trying to find examples of here's a child that is in the news because we're hearing these stories in the law cases. So, this child's been in the news or the situation has been in the news. One of the things I like to do is kind of casually, particularly with my students, is, hey, did you hear the news story? What do you think? And that kind of opens it up without being quite so intimidating. Um, but yeah, I think we need to try to talk about it in ways where we're not trying to force an opinion, which I'm assuming most of us don't try to do that, but we're sometimes assumed to be doing that, but in ways that are more conversational, maybe storytelling. Stories are incredibly powerful. So if we can find examples ripped from the headlines kinds of things, story behind the story, I think those go a long way. And the more local your story, I mean, sometimes I'll even, imagine your child. How would your child feel if they suddenly couldn't participate in sport? They're 10 years old. What would they do all day? How would they feel? How can we help other people not go through that?
Thank you.
So I think I just barely kind of briefed the edges of that.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Dr. Crane. Next question here. I'm wondering if you can share any statistics on the number of trans female versus trans male athletes.
This is really interesting. Well, the easy answer is no. Um, I mean, the NCAA statistics are male and female. Um, Generally speaking, the world is not all that concerned about trans male athletes because presumably they were born into female bodies. Female bodies are assumed to be less athletic. They are less threatening in sport. It's like, fine, see if they can be successful. So I think we don't see as much conversation around trans male athletes, and the research is predominantly around trans female athletes that I've seen. Or when we see studies, which typically are with more recreational athletes or exercisers, males and females are included in the sample together. So no, I have not seen statistics is the short answer to that.
Yeah, related question. Much of the vitriol and ban surrounding trans participation in sport surrounds trans women, where trans men also compete. How do you explain where that double standard comes from?
Wait, can you say that again? Sorry.
Sorry. Much of the vitriol and ban surrounding transgender participation in sport surrounds trans women, whereas trans men also compete. How do you explain where that double standard comes from?
And again, I think it comes from the sexism in sport, that assumption if you're born into a female body, that you're not threatening in sport. So therefore, it's presumed that a trans male is not taking opportunities away from cisgender male athletes, that the trans male is not going to be a highly successful athlete. The trans female athletes, the concerns really come up when we're talking about nothing ever really hits the news until somebody wins. Like I said, nobody paid attention to Ivy League swimming until suddenly a trans athlete won a couple of events. So as soon as we see a successful trans athlete on the women's side, it's like, wait a minute, there should have been a cis female who had that opportunity. Or you're taking scholarships away. The irony is the case in Connecticut of the two high school trans female runners that were sued, presumably for taking opportunities away from cisgender female athletes. First, they didn't win every race. They sometimes won, sometimes lost, as typically happens. And second, the cisgender athletes who were suing them got scholarships. The trans athletes didn't get scholarships. So it sort of became a moot point legally because It didn't happen. So I think there's this great concern that if we allow these trans athletes into sport and they're better than the cis athletes, they're going to take opportunities away. Rather than thinking in terms that most of us lose to somebody. Unless you're Katie Ledecky, you don't win every race. There's going to be someone better than you. It shouldn't matter if that's trans or if that's a cisgender athlete.
Thank you. And I'd love to be able to respond to every concept, but we have so many questions in the chat, so I'm going to keep asking them. Um, Question from a trainee perspective. For those of us training and or working in collegiate sport, what can we be doing to support trans and gender nonconforming athletes despite these bans?
If they're there with you, if you have, I mean, because again, these bans mean they're kicked out. One thing, and I don't know how well this would go over, one thing is if there are trans athletes who you know of who are banned, is there a way to keep them involved? And some would love to do this and some would hate this idea. So potentially, can they be part of the coaching, a volunteer coach? Can they be part of maybe some other statistics or some other equipment? Is there a way that they could be part of the team still without performing? And like I said, some would want to stay with the team, and others would be that's going to be too hard because I can't play. So if you know them and you can talk to them, that's one avenue. The reality is reaching out to them. Like I said before, doing what you can to ensure that they know that there's someone there on their side. Because as I said, one person can make them less suicidal. If there are ways to encourage other members of the team. So if you're working with a team and they're like, wait, it's not fair that Johnny or Susie can't be with us. What can we do to reach out to that person? So how do we help that person know that we still care? So providing avenues to stay in touch. I also think a lot of educational things, talking about the issues, talking with the teams about why that athlete's no longer there. And here's what we know, and here's what you might read in the newspaper, and here's what you should tell your parents. So I think providing them, and again, age appropriate, but providing them information that's going to help them understand what's going on. The politics are hard. I mean, when you're talking 6-year-olds suddenly can't be on a team with their friends, how do you explain that to their friends who didn't know that person was trans? And now they're trying to figure out, I've been on teams, I've been in school, what's going on? So finding ways to talk about it. I think we need to keep the conversation going as much as possible. I think that's how we're going to get people to be more empathetic, more understanding, and more educated.
Thank you. All right, from another participant, the findings you presented relate to Western culture, a culture in which there is also room for liberalism. What are the findings on transgender people in Middle Eastern cultures where religion dictates behavior and perceptions? And how would you approach the topic with a population from such regions with religious perceptions?
Now that is a fabulous question. Honestly, that's not one I am all that um, well prepared in. I don't work in those communities, so yeah, I'm hoping maybe somebody out there has more experience than me working with people in more religious communities. Whereas, I mean, I think you have to again create open conversations, provide education, but yeah, I'm not going to have a really good answer for this one. I'm really sorry.
Totally okay. And for that person who
And
asked,
I know there's people out there. Feel free to put in the chat because I've seen some of the names here. I know some of you have done much better work on this than I have.
yes, and feel free to reach out to the Diversity Collective too. We can also help source some of those resources for that question. Okay, next question. What are some of your reflections on the relationship between gender surveillance and racism within sport?
Oh, they go hand in hand. I mean, this goes back to the early days where female athletes were told they had to look more feminine. We can look at what's happened with the intersex athletes and who's being called out and sex tested, gender surveilled there. Women of color, well, let me put it this way. The standards of femininity in our society are often based on kind of this white, heterosexual, upper middle class values. And for people of color, it's really hard to fit those white standards. So racism is a huge part of this. I think some of the huge amounts of vitriol that we've seen have been spewed at trans women in black trans women of color in sport. And the case in Connecticut, the two sprinters were people of color, and you just don't look right. You don't look feminine enough. So yeah, I think the two are totally wrapped up together. And again, I only have so much time today to talk about some of these issues, but absolutely we need to look at the overlapping isms, particularly when we're talking about immigrant populations, people of color, and gender identity.
Thank you, Dr. Krane. I want to try to turn the topic a little bit with a beautiful question asked by one of our participants of, do you know of any positive examples within the world of sport, organizations, associations, countries that are applying a constructive way to include trans athletes in high performance environments?
Yes, and now I wish I had gone back and reread this. Okay, shameless self-promotion. Tanya Pruitt-White and I just recently released the book Reimagining the Gendering of Sport. And in that, one of the chapters in that, we present examples, particularly in the final chapter, of what non-binary sport might look like. And we give some examples and the various ways that we might be including people of varied gender identities together in sport. And I'm not going to, off the top of my head, remember the exact name of the league. There is an Asian league where they created a large sport, sort of like a gay games type of thing, but for aimed at a sporting competition with no gender markers. You could express whatever you want. So nothing asked for gender, nothing. And they talked about, they had these great examples of people like going, wait a minute, there's some male-bodied people that we're going to assume are male identified, that we as female identified people are competing against. Do we stand a chance? And then it turned out in this particular example, it was a group of gay men that were not real great athletes, that the women, the trans and cis women on this team that were concerned about it, basically just had a really fun competition with them and were not just blown out of the water. And they all just, I mean, there's different ways to look at this. And I did a really bad job of giving that example, but look at the last chapter in that book and you will find it. There are examples out there. There are ways to think about sport. And I think we need to start thinking about this more at the younger ages, because I don't think tomorrow the NCAA is going to get rid of gender breakdown, sex breakdown. But at the same time, when we include boys and girls on teams together, they learn to be teammates. They learn to work together. They learn to talk to each other. And again, the best athlete is whoever makes the most points, goals. It's not just, oh, that's the boys' team. They're better. They deserve more. So I think, well, there are examples out there. And again, people feel free to put into the chat if you have more specific examples.
Thank you, Dr. Crane. I think you're doing a wonderful job. You're also giving people time and space to go search for more resources, which is great. It's not just this talk, it extends beyond. The next question is kind of a two-part question, so I'm going to read the whole piece for you. What is our role as consultants in opening sport to transgender individuals? For example, if we're working with coaches or teams or organizations that have placed bans on transgender athletes, what methods of outreach have you found successful?
Oof, lot there. Well, in this current moment, again, I keep going back to this education and talking and sharing personal stories. I think one of the things I think when we think social justice more broadly, to me, social justice is all about empathy. We have to learn the perspective of other people in order to empathize their circumstances. So I think the more we can present stories in writing, in what we pull out of the news, in our daily conversations, I think that's a really good starting point. I think at the moment, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I don't know if I've seen examples of huge successes because these bans are new for the most part. Because while they were scattered initially, there were other areas like, okay, this sport, well, maybe there's another way, that athlete can go to a different organization or sometimes a different sport or play at a different level. Whereas at this point, right now, at least in the US, all college sport, all school sport. I think one thing we can think of, and I should have mentioned this earlier, non-school sport is not bound by Title IX or the executive order that bans trans athletes from participating. So we can provide opportunities and inclusiveness in other types of recreational, travel league, other types of sporting environments outside of the schools. And I think at the moment, that's probably our best avenue to get people to reach out to trans athletes and keep them involved. In the meantime, like I said, get political. We need people standing up and talking, and we need parents of cisgender kids, athletes, non-athletes, as well as the parents, obviously, of the trans athletes who I'm sure are already fighting. I hear enough of that from various people I've interacted with. But we need other people to come forward and talk about why these bans are not fair, talk about why inclusion is so much more important, and think about what are we teaching the kids in sport? That if you lose to a trans person, that's horrible. If you lose to a cis person, oh, that's just going to happen. We're teaching them to scrutinize each other. We're teaching them to stereotype. We're teaching them to discriminate. Is that really what we want to teach through sport? I think more of us look at sport as a place where we can learn, like I said, leadership and all these other great skills. That should be where we're putting our efforts.
Thank you, Dr. Krane. Now, I just want to check in with you. We've done about 15 minutes of Q&A. We do have about 10-ish more minutes in the webinar. Are you okay to keep answering a few more questions?
Oh yeah, I purposely stopped early knowing
Perfect.
that there'd be questions.
Wonderful. Okay, next question. How do we support governing bodies like USA Rugby, swimming, etc., who are being forced to add additional regulations to protect women in sports? Many of the board members that this person's talked with are all trying desperately to write policies as loosely as possible, but are still feeling really stuck.
Oh, another really good question. I don't work at that level as a consultant or as an athlete coach, anything like that. Though I do think um, providing talking points, providing resources. There are groups, like I point out, I mean, the Canadian Center for Ethics in Sport, their report is written in a real, I don't want to say it's a lay report, but it's written in really easily digestible language that I think, and I don't want to say we want to dumb things down, but if you give someone a statistical analysis of things, that's not what they're going to be reading and find interesting. But if we can find resources, again, with the stories or resources that are written for a broader audience, and they're out there, that's where we're going to see a lot more sway in giving them the language. I think one of the things that I've gotten feedback when I've done talks on this topic and other times is that giving people the language, the arguments, like I thought that, but I didn't really know how to say it before. So providing them the talking points, I think, is huge. I think providing them the emotional support. We forget about that. This battle is huge. It takes a toll on everybody who is empathetic. So providing opportunities to take it in, take care of ourselves, reach out to those we know that need to be taken care of. I will say that personally, I'm not all that optimistic of some of these national, international governing bodies are going to suddenly change their minds because well, I don't know about because of everything that I said earlier in terms of the political circumstances surrounding all this. I wish I could be more optimistic, but I think we need to see a groundswelling of support before we're going to see drastic change. I'm not saying that's not going to happen because I know many of us on this call, we're not giving up. But I definitely think we need to think kind of locally and work our way up. I will say also that Chris Mosier, Anna Baith, and one other author is coming out with a new book on transgender athletes where they're sharing the stories of transgender athletes, and it's written for a broad audience. And I think it just came out like within a week or so. So keep an eye out for that as well as a really good source.
Absolutely will. This will be our last question. I'm so sorry we can't get to the rest of the questions, but just want to give you the time to answer and then finalize a few logistics. So, related to a previous question, but maybe more from your experience and perspective, how do you support trans athletes and not and gender nonconforming athletes when religious beliefs contribute to the challenges? And how do you kind of unpack it from that perspective?
I think part of it is giving them space to talk and to work through and think about their circumstances. One of the things I've been fortunate when this has come up with athletes I've worked with is to be able to connect them with a peer or somebody else that I know who's also grappling with similar types of issues where they can sit down and they might not even be the same religion, but they're both dealing with religiosity and being queer or trans and trying to deal with that. Um, in some cases, they can talk with family, people in their spiritual community. A lot of times they're not, I should say, other times they're not as comfortable doing that. Um, Again, it's not an area that I've worked in a lot, so I don't have real specific suggestions. But again, I think being there for that person, being willing to talk to them, listening to them, um, coming up with like what are some potential different avenues we can take this. I think, and spending the time to kind of talk through various different possibilities of if you do this, what might happen? If you do this, what might happen? What do you really want? Thinking through what's most important for your joy, for your happiness, for your personal success. And how do we get that from these two different identities or groups within your life. And I don't think it's easy, but I think it's definitely being willing to address it is huge. That's a huge first step.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Crane, for this talk and for answering all of these questions of our attendees today. As we conclude today's session, I just want to give a final few reminders. Please complete the online evaluation when you receive it today later via email. Your feedback is important to us, and you're welcome to suggest ideas for future programs. You must complete the evaluation in order to receive your continuing education credit. Your certificate will be available upon completion. Thank you all for your participation and engagement today, and hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.